The war enters a new phase. The war has now reached a critical milestone, 30 days in, and instead of slowing down, the conflict is widening, hardening, and becoming more dangerous by the hour. Sirens continue to sound across Israel. Missile salvos are still being launched. Families are racing into shelters. Entire communities are living with seconds to react, never knowing whether the next alert will end in an interception overhead or a direct hit on the ground. This is no longer a conflict defined by isolated strikes or symbolic retaliation. What we are now witnessing is a sustained regional war of pressure, attrition, and escalating signals. On one side, Israel is intensifying operations deep inside Iranian territory, targeting what it describes as the backbone of Iran's nuclear-linked infrastructure, military production network, and strategic war machine. On the other, Iran and its allied forces are continuing to test Israel's air defenses, expand the pressure on multiple fronts, and widen the circle of instability around the region. And now, overshadowing all of it, stands the United States. Because this war is no longer only about daily missile exchanges or one more airstrike in one more province. It is now also about what happens next if diplomacy fails. Washington has extended a deadline. Military assets continue to move. Additional troops are arriving in the region. And every move being made now appears designed to send one unmistakable message. The current phase may still be the warning shot before something much larger. The atmosphere across the region reflects that shift. In Israel, the public is exhausted but alert. In Iran, the pressure is said to be mounting as infrastructure continues to take hits. Across the Gulf, governments are watching the Strait of Hormuz with growing alarm. In Yemen, the Houthis have entered the picture again. In Lebanon, fighting continues on the northern front. In Saudi Arabia, a reported strike on a U.S. airbase has added yet another layer of urgency. Everything feels connected now. Every missile launched in the north of Israel connects to calculations being made in Tehran. Every strike on industrial or nuclear-linked targets in Iran connects to decisions being weighed in Washington. Every drone intercepted over the Red Sea connects to fears about global shipping, oil flows, and economic shockwaves that could ripple far beyond the battlefield. This is what makes Day 30 so important. It is not just another day in the war. It may be the day the conflict begins to shift from a brutal ongoing campaign into a final countdown toward one of two outcomes: a deal under pressure or a broader military intervention that changes the region in ways that cannot easily be reversed. And for millions watching this unfold, there is one growing realization. The war is no longer just being measured in days. It is now being measured in thresholds. How much more damage can each side absorb? How long can the pressure continue? How far will Iran go? How far will Israel push? And how long will the United States wait before deciding that the current strategy is no longer enough? Because if the first month was about shock, survival, and initial objectives, the second month could become something else entirely. It could become the phase where all restraint begins to collapse. Israel under fire, civilians living in the shadow of sirens. For civilians inside Israel, the war is not an abstract geopolitical contest. It is immediate, physical, and deeply personal. It is the sound of sirens cutting through the day. It is the instinctive run toward a shelter. It is the trembling wait for impact. It is the silence afterward, when families emerge and look around to see whether their neighborhood is still standing. Fresh damage has continued to emerge from incoming rocket and missile fire. Some of the hardest scenes have come from residential zones where homes, vehicles, and entire streets have been left shattered. In one strike zone, rows of damaged cars and torn-up infrastructure told the story of just how close civilians are living to the line of fire. Families who only moments earlier were in the middle of an ordinary weekend suddenly found themselves surrounded by broken glass, sirens, smoke, and fear. The human toll is not only measured in deaths and injuries, though those numbers continue to climb. It is also measured in trauma, in parents trying to reassure children while they themselves are terrified, in elderly residents trying to process another attack, in communities that no longer experience normal time because every hour is shaped by the possibility of the next barrage. There have been reports of injuries affecting multiple civilians in single attacks, including children. Some people made it to shelters in time, others did not. In one case, a man in his 50s was reportedly killed after failing to enter a protected space during an incoming strike. That detail alone captures the brutal reality of this war. Survival can come down to seconds, to judgment, to whether one warning is taken seriously enough before the sky changes. The pressure on hospitals has also become part of the broader story. Since the war began, thousands of Israelis have reportedly required medical attention or hospitalization. Even those released quickly carry the memory of what happened with them. Emergency teams, medical staff, and local authorities are working under constant stress. Every new barrage carries not only the threat of casualties, but the cumulative strain of a society forced to remain in emergency mode for a month. And there is no true pause ahead. Ordinarily, holidays offer a psychological break, a return to ritual, family, and stability. But in wartime, even sacred moments are reorganized around survival. Families preparing for holiday gatherings are doing so with one eye on the clock and one ear tuned to alerts. There is an expectation now that dinners may take place near shelters, that celebrations may be interrupted, that every gathering must include an escape route. That changes a nation. It changes how people sleep. It changes how they travel. It changes how children grow through these weeks. A war of missiles is also a war of nerves, and Iran's strategy, according to repeated descriptions from the battlefield, appears aimed not only at causing damage, but at spreading fear across a wide civilian radius. There have also been references to the use of cluster-type threats and fragmented debris fields, expanding the danger even after interception. That matters because successful interceptions do not always mean complete safety on the ground. Debris can fall, fragments can injure. Panic can spread. The sky itself becomes a hazard zone. For Israeli civilians, that is the reality of day 30. Even when the defense systems work, the fear remains. Even when the missile is stopped, the fragments can still come down. Even when one salvo ends, another alert may begin minutes later. This is what a prolonged missile war does. It stretches society. It wears on discipline. It tests whether people can remain vigilant for weeks at a time without making one fatal mistake. And yet, despite the destruction, many communities remain standing. People continue to return to damaged streets. They continue to clear debris. They continue to check on neighbors. They continue to adapt. That resilience has become one of the defining features of the conflict inside Israel. But resilience does not mean normality. It means survival under abnormal conditions. And that distinction matters because the longer this war lasts, the more the burden shifts from endurance to exhaustion. Inside Iran. The air campaign targeting nuclear and military infrastructure. While civilians in Israel continue to endure missile attacks, the war inside Iran has entered a new and highly consequential stage. According to the latest battlefield descriptions, Israeli forces now claim to have established a level of operational freedom in Iranian skies that allows them to strike selected targets with growing precision and frequency. That is an extraordinary claim, and if accurate in practical terms, it changes the strategic balance of the war. Over the weekend, major coordinated strikes were reportedly carried out across multiple locations inside Iran. The targets were not random. They were described as core elements tied to the regime's military production base and nuclear-linked infrastructure. In other words, this was not only about punishing Iran, it was about degrading the systems that could allow Iran to rearm, rebuild, and potentially reconstitute strategic capabilities after the war. Among the most significant reported targets was the heavy water plant at Arak. Heavy water facilities matter because of their relevance to reactor operation and their long-term connection to plutonium pathways associated with weapons potential. Even if some of these facilities have civilian explanations attached to them, the broader allegation from the Israeli side has remained consistent. Much of Iran's nuclear network is viewed not as a peaceful energy system, but as a layered architecture designed to conceal military ambition beneath technical complexity. Additional sites reportedly hit include enrichment-linked facilities, missile production infrastructure, and manufacturing centers said to support Iran's broader military supply chain. There were also reports of strikes on major steel plants, with the argument that these industrial centers serve not only economic functions, but also military-industrial ones. That distinction is key. In modern warfare, industrial targets become strategic targets when they feed weapons production, logistics, engineering, or sanctioned procurement networks. If these reports are accurate, the cumulative effect could be severe. Iran's war effort does not depend only on missile launchers and military bases. It depends on the factories that make components, the industrial chains that replace losses, the logistical routes that move material, and the technical ecosystems that support long-term strategic projects. When those are hit repeatedly, the damage extends far beyond one building. It reaches into the regime's ability to sustain pressure over time, and that appears to be exactly what this campaign is trying to achieve. Not a symbolic demonstration, not a one-night shock raid, but a methodical dismantling of the machinery behind Iran's military endurance. There is also a powerful psychological layer to these strikes. When a state's skies are no longer secure, when critical facilities hundreds of miles from the front remain vulnerable, when every new day may bring another successful strike against another important node, the sense of strategic control begins to erode. That is especially significant for a regime that has long relied on deterrence, ambiguity, and the perception of depth as part of its defense posture. The message being sent is blunt. Nowhere is automatically safe anymore. And that message is not only intended for the Iranian leadership. It is also meant for negotiators, proxy networks, regional observers, and major powers watching from a distance. It says that time is not working in Iran's favor. It says that delay may not preserve leverage but destroy it. It says that if Tehran waits too long, it may enter any future negotiation from a position of severe strategic damage rather than cautious parity. There are still unresolved questions, of course. One of the biggest involves highly enriched uranium stockpiles and materials that may be difficult to neutralize from the air alone. Air power can destroy facilities, crater infrastructure, and collapse visible systems. But material stockpiles, underground storage, and dispersed assets present a more complicated problem. That is one reason why talk of possible limited ground options continues to hover in the background of the war. Still, from the perspective of the current air campaign, the direction is clear. The goal appears to be to finish this phase of the war with Iran's military and nuclear-linked architecture damaged so heavily that a rapid recovery becomes impossible. That would not automatically end the conflict. It would not settle the political future of Iran. It would not remove every threat, but it would radically alter the military landscape in which all future decisions are made. And perhaps that is why these strikes matter so much right now, because they are not simply attacks on infrastructure. They are attacks on Iran's ability to shape the next phase from a position of strength. The American deadline, diplomacy, pressure, and the April 6th clock. Hovering over the battlefield now is a date that may determine the next chapter of the war, April 6th. That deadline has become the focal point of intense speculation because it represents more than a calendar marker. It represents the last visible window for diplomacy before the possibility of a much harsher American response. The current message from Washington, as described through public statements and reporting, is layered and deliberate. On the surface, the United States is still allowing space for talks. But beneath that diplomatic framing sits an unmistakable military signal. The window is open, but it is not open forever. This is classic pressure diplomacy backed by force posture. The United States appears to be trying to create a final interval in which Iran can choose de-escalation without allowing Tehran to believe that time is on its side. Every extension, every delay, every warning is also a way of increasing the weight of the next decision. Because if the deadline passes without movement, then whatever follows can be presented not as impulsive escalation, but as the consequence of rejected opportunities. And that matters politically, diplomatically, and militarily. Politically, it allows Washington to demonstrate restraint before any possible expansion. Diplomatically, it gives allies and regional partners a framework through which to coordinate. Militarily, it buys time to position assets, move forces, refine plans, and prepare for contingencies that may never be used but must be ready if needed. Statements coming from senior U.S. officials have reflected this dual-track strategy. On one hand, they have emphasized that the bulk of military objectives may already be close to completion or progressing on schedule. On the other, they have warned of what could come next if Iran uses the aftermath of this phase to entrench new forms of coercion, especially around international waterways. That is why the Strait of Hormuz keeps returning to the center of the conversation. The issue is no longer only whether Iran can endure airstrikes. It is whether Iran is trying to preserve leverage by threatening one of the most sensitive maritime choke points in the world. If Tehran believes it can emerge from the current phase still able to squeeze global shipping, raise costs, disrupt energy markets, and impose strategic tolls on the world economy, then from Washington's perspective, the war may not really be over, even if the bombing slows. So the deadline is about more than a ceasefire. It is about the conditions under which the war can stop without leaving a larger threat intact. For Iran, that creates a dilemma. Enter negotiations now, and it may do so under visible military pressure after weeks of cumulative damage. Refuse, delay, or gamble on regional fragmentation, and it risks facing a sharper escalation from an American side that appears increasingly prepared to move beyond warnings. This is why every word matters now. Public denials of negotiations may be aimed at internal audiences, signaling defiance and resistance. Quiet back-channel contacts may serve a completely different purpose, probing for terms, conditions, and guarantees. In wartime diplomacy, public language is often part of the battlefield. It can mislead, intimidate, buy time, or shape perceptions. The real negotiations, if they exist, usually happen behind layers of strategic theater. And yet, even if talks are happening, there is no guarantee they are gaining traction. A diplomatic process only matters if both sides still believe a deal is better than the alternatives. Right now, that calculation may still be shifting by the hour. Every successful strike on Iranian infrastructure changes Tehran's incentives. Every continued missile barrage against Israel hardens the resolve of those arguing against concessions. Every reported attack on U.S. personnel or facilities raises the political cost of patience in Washington. So the April 6th deadline is not merely counting down days, it is counting down options. It is the ticking clock at the center of the war. And if the next 10 days fail to produce movement, then this conflict may enter a new stage in which America stops asking whether Iran will choose a deal and starts acting as though it already made its choice. The strike on a U.S. airbase and why it changes the calculation. One of the most dangerous developments in this phase of the war has been the reported Iranian strike on a U.S. airbase in Saudi Arabia. If confirmed in the way described, this is not a minor side event. It is a signal with enormous consequences. Because the moment American troops are directly injured in a conflict zone where Washington is already weighing broader action, the internal calculation inside the United States begins to change. Strategic patience becomes harder to defend. Diplomatic timelines become more fragile. The cost of appearing passive rises sharply. Reports indicate that ballistic missiles and drones were used in an attack on the Prince Sultan Air Base, causing injuries to American soldiers and damage to aircraft. If that description reflects the event accurately, then Iran did not just send a symbolic message. It crossed into a category of action that forces Washington to consider whether deterrence is eroding and whether delayed escalation is being interpreted as hesitation. From Iran's perspective, such a strike could serve multiple purposes. It could be intended as retaliation. It could be an attempt to show that the war is not one-sided. It could be a warning to regional governments not to host operations against it. It could also be a gamble that limited direct attacks on U.S. assets will create fear, caution, or urgency for de-escalation. But that gamble is dangerous, because history shows that the United States can absorb many provocations rhetorically, but once uniformed personnel are wounded and military assets are hit, the pressure for a response intensifies dramatically. Even if that response is not immediate, the event enters the ledger. It shapes future planning. It hardens attitudes among military planners and political figures who argue that Iran must not be allowed to calibrate violence upward without paying a visible price. There is another reason this matters: geography. Saudi Arabia is not just another location in the war's outer ring. It is central to Gulf security, regional energy logic, and American force projection in the area. An Iranian strike there expands the meaning of the conflict. It says the war can reach beyond Israel and Iran into the infrastructure of America's regional posture. That immediately raises fears in Gulf capitals and among global markets that a wider spiral could be underway. The symbolism is just as important as the tactical details. A strike on a U.S. base tells regional actors that they are not merely observers. It tells them the shield around them is under stress. It tells them neutrality may not protect them. And it reminds everyone watching that the war's real danger lies not only in what has already happened, but in how each side interprets the threshold that has been crossed. For Washington, the question now becomes brutally simple. Was this a one-off act in a narrowing diplomatic window, or proof that Iran is willing to raise the stakes precisely while the U.S. is still choosing restraint? If policymakers decide it was the second, then the chances of a more forceful American move rise substantially. That does not necessarily mean full-scale war. It could mean targeted retaliation. It could mean the destruction of additional infrastructure. It could mean maritime operations. It could mean covert and cyber components. It could mean limited ground actions attached to specific objectives. But whatever the form, the logic would be the same. Re-establish deterrence before further erosion invites even bolder moves. This is why the reported strike on the U.S. base is one of the most important developments of Day 30, because it compresses time, it narrows patience, it shifts the conversation away from abstract red lines and toward immediate consequences. And in wars like this, once the question becomes how long a superpower can tolerate direct attacks on its people, the room for ambiguity begins to disappear.
And before we go any further, if you still haven't liked this video or subscribed to the channel, go do it right now. Don't miss more analysis like this that only we bring you here on America First Watch. Because while the mainstream gives you headlines, here we break down what is really happening behind the scenes, what matters most, and what could happen next before everyone else starts talking about it. So hit like, subscribe, and stay with us, because what comes next may be the most important part of this entire war.
Tripoli, 3,500 Marines, and the shadow of a limited ground operation. The arrival of 3,500 Marines aboard the USS Tripoli is one of the clearest signs yet that the United States wants every option on the table. This move matters not only because of the number of troops involved, but because of what that deployment represents. Amphibious and expeditionary forces are not moved casually into a theater already on edge unless there is a serious reason to build flexibility. They are moved when planners want the ability to respond quickly, operate across multiple scenarios, and signal credible readiness without committing publicly to one course of action. That is exactly what this deployment appears to do. For weeks, senior voices have insisted that there is no appetite for a full-scale invasion and no desire for a drawn-out ground war. And that distinction is crucial. The options reportedly under consideration are not about conquering Iran. They are about specific, limited objectives if diplomacy fails, and if air power alone cannot solve the remaining strategic problems. Those problems appear to center on two broad categories. The first is the Strait of Hormuz, and the nearby island geography that could be used to threaten or obstruct maritime transit. If Iran tries to lock in a post-strike leverage position by controlling or intimidating traffic through that corridor, then opening the waterway could become a military necessity rather than a theoretical concern. The second is the issue of highly enriched uranium and critical materials that may be difficult to neutralize completely from the air. If strategic stockpiles remain intact, deeply buried or movable, then planners must at least consider whether a precision ground action would be required to secure, remove, or destroy what bombing alone cannot guarantee. That is where the USS Tripoli and the Marines come in. Their presence does not prove such operations will happen, but it makes those operations more believable, and credibility is itself a weapon. If Iran believes the United States is only bluffing, it may wait out the deadline and calculate that Washington will stop short of anything riskier. But if Iran sees air power, naval presence, Marines, and regional logistics all aligning into a real contingency package, then the psychological pressure grows. Military preparation is often less about wanting to fight than about convincing the other side that you are ready if forced to. Still, there is no denying the complexity. Even a limited ground operation carries significant risk. Iran remains a large country with surviving ground forces, local defensive depth, and the capacity to concentrate resistance around likely objective zones. Any insertion would depend on overwhelming air superiority, extensive pre-strike shaping, intelligence precision, and strict mission limits. The cost would not be measured only in operational difficulty, but in escalation potential. Once troops are used on the ground, even briefly, the entire war enters a more volatile phase. That is why this current posture is so significant. It sits in the tense space between deterrence and action. The Marines aboard the USS Tripoli are not merely passengers in a war theater. They are part of a message to Tehran that the deadline is backed by capability, a message to allies that the United States is planning beyond airstrikes, a message to markets and adversaries alike that the war's next phase, if triggered, may involve a level of direct American participation far beyond what has been visible so far. There is also a domestic dimension. By moving forces now, Washington can later say it acted responsibly, prepared carefully, and gave diplomacy every chance before taking any further step. That is politically valuable if escalation comes. It allows future decisions to be framed not as improvisation, but as reluctant necessity after visible restraint. So the question is not whether the presence of the USS Tripoli means war on the ground is inevitable. It does not. The real question is whether its arrival makes the threat of limited ground action credible enough to change Iran's behavior before such action becomes necessary. And if it does not, then the significance of this deployment may only become clear in hindsight, when people look back and realize that the military pieces were being put into place long before the world fully accepted what might be coming. The Houthis enter the war and the region widens again. As if the conflict were not already broad enough, another front has now become more active: Yemen. The Houthis, long recognized as an Iranian-backed regional proxy with the capacity to disrupt maritime routes and launch long-range attacks, have now re-entered the war directly against Israel. Sirens in the far south, ballistic missile launches, and drone interceptions have all signaled that Tehran's wider network is no longer remaining on the sidelines. In military terms, the Houthis may not change the core balance of power between Israel, Iran, and the United States, but that does not make them strategically irrelevant. In fact, their importance lies precisely in the fact that they can widen the battlefield at relatively low cost to Iran, while forcing defensive attention across new distances. That is one of the enduring advantages of proxy warfare. A state under pressure can expand the geography of the conflict through partners and aligned groups, compelling its opponents to think in terms not only of one front, but of many. The Houthis have demonstrated before that even if their firepower is limited compared with major states, they can still disrupt shipping, alter insurance markets, threaten choke points, and force navies to spread resources. Their strength is not necessarily in battlefield dominance. It is in strategic irritation, unpredictability, and the ability to turn maritime arteries into zones of sustained tension. That becomes even more serious when placed alongside the broader fears surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. Because now the war's maritime threat picture does not belong only to the Gulf. It also stretches toward the Red Sea and adjacent routes where shipping already operates, under heightened caution. This is how regional wars become global economic events. You do not need one side to destroy a navy to disrupt the world. You only need enough instability in enough maritime choke points for enough days that risk perception changes. Shipping slows, routes shift, costs climb, energy markets tighten, insurance premiums rise. Nervous governments begin pressing for outcomes that serve stability over principle. That may be exactly the kind of pressure Iran wants to build. By activating the Houthis, Tehran can signal that even if it is absorbing blows at home, it retains the ability to create strategic friction elsewhere. It can say to the region and the world, "You may hit us, but the consequences will not remain inside our borders." At the same time, the entry of the Houthis also carries risks for Iran, because once proxies broaden the war visibly, they also strengthen the case among Iran's enemies that this is not merely a contained conflict, but a coordinated regional challenge that must be answered on multiple levels. In other words, the more the axis widens, the easier it becomes for Washington and its partners to justify a broader coalition response. So the Houthis' entrance cuts both ways. It gives Iran another pressure point, but it also reinforces the argument that the problem is bigger than one country, one missile front, or one set of facilities. It tells the world that the war is connected through a web of aligned actors, each capable of creating chaos in strategically sensitive places. And for Israel, the symbolism matters too. It confirms that this is not a limited duel. It is a struggle against an interconnected architecture of proxies, supply routes, and ideological alignment that can reactivate at chosen moments. Day 30 has made that architecture visible once again. What looked at first like a two-state confrontation is now behaving more and more like a multi-theater regional war with global economic implications. And that is exactly why the entry of the Houthis matters far beyond the actual number of missiles they launch. The Strait of Hormuz, the choke point that could decide the war. If there is one geographic location that could determine how this war ends, it is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow maritime corridor has always been one of the most strategically sensitive places on Earth. But now it has become something else, the pressure valve at the center of the entire conflict. Because as long as there is uncertainty around freedom of navigation there, the war remains bigger than battlefield gains and losses. It remains a threat to the world economy itself. That is why so many officials, analysts, and regional voices keep returning to the same issue. Iran may lose infrastructure, it may lose production capacity, it may lose elements of its military posture. But if it can still turn the Strait of Hormuz into a bargaining instrument, then it retains a form of leverage that radiates far beyond the immediate combat zone. And that is unacceptable to every state whose energy security, trade flow, or shipping exposure depends on those waters. Reports have described gestures, partial openings, temporary allowances, and warnings. But underneath all that lies one basic truth. The world does not want a future in which a radicalized state under military pressure can tax, threaten, or selectively choke one of the planet's most important maritime arteries whenever it chooses. This is not merely a regional concern, it is a global one. From Asia to Europe, from oil markets to industrial supply chains, the stability of Hormuz matters. That is why the issue has become central to the American argument. U.S. officials have increasingly emphasized that the future of those waters cannot be left to coercion or post-war blackmail. If the conflict ends while the strait remains vulnerable to renewed Iranian pressure, then from Washington's perspective, the strategic mission remains incomplete. And that is where the Gulf states enter the story. For them, the situation is deeply uncomfortable. They are geographically exposed, their economies are tied to maritime flow, their infrastructure is vulnerable, their instinct often is caution. Avoid risk, keep channels open, do not provoke a stronger blowback if it can be avoided. But this war may be forcing a change in that calculus, because the longer the pressure on maritime routes continues, the more costly passivity becomes. There have been increasing signs that some Gulf actors may be moving toward a more vocal alignment with efforts to guarantee freedom of navigation, even if they are still reluctant to frame such cooperation as formally joining the war. That distinction is politically important for them, but militarily the outcome could still matter. Support for reopening, securing, or patrolling the strait could become one of the defining coalition efforts of the next stage. Yet hesitation remains understandable. Gulf governments must worry not only about what happens if they act, but what happens if they act, and the Iranian regime survives. Retaliation, sabotage, and prolonged pressure are all part of that fear. This is why so many of them have historically tried to balance, hedge, and wait. But waiting becomes harder when the war reaches your ports, your exports, your airspace, and your economic nervous system. And that may be the larger transformation underway now. Iran's strategy, intended perhaps to frighten Gulf states into demanding an early stop, may instead be pushing some of them closer to the opposite conclusion, that the war must end in a way that permanently reduces Tehran's ability to hold the region hostage through choke points and proxies. If that trend continues, then the Strait of Hormuz will not merely be the place the war threatens most dramatically. It may become the place where the international response finally hardens. Because once the world decides that open water cannot remain under the shadow of coercion, the conflict stops being only about Israel and Iran. It becomes a question of whether the global system will tolerate strategic extortion at one of its most vital arteries, and that is a question powerful states rarely ignore for long. The Gulf states fear hesitation and the possibility of a new alignment. The Gulf states now find themselves in one of the most uncomfortable positions of the entire war. They are close enough to be vulnerable, wealthy enough to be targeted, and strategically important enough that their choices could influence the outcome. Yet many of them still appear caught between caution and necessity. This is the central contradiction shaping their role. On paper, several Gulf states have every reason to oppose Iranian coercion. Their economies depend on energy flows, trade continuity, and regional confidence. Their territory and infrastructure are exposed to missiles, drones, sabotage, and pressure campaigns. Some have reportedly taken serious hits already. Others fear they could be next if the conflict intensifies. And yet, opposing Iran openly is not the same as quietly fearing Iran. For years, many of these governments have practiced strategic caution. They have hedged, balanced, mediated, delayed, and watched. In part, that comes from geography. Israel can operate at distance. The United States projects from across the globe. But the Gulf states live next door to Iran's retaliatory reach. Their ports, desalination plants, export terminals, airports, and urban centers sit within range of the kinds of threats this war has already put on display. So their hesitation is not only political, it is existential. Still, there are signs that the current war is shaking old assumptions. The more they are hit, the less convincing the strategy of silence becomes. The more their economic interests are endangered, the more dangerous fence-sitting appears. The more clearly Iran demonstrates that proximity will not save them from pressure, the more some of them may conclude that only a firmer regional alignment can reduce long-term vulnerability. That does not mean they will all move the same way. The Gulf is not politically uniform. Different states have different relationships, calculations, domestic constraints, and foreign policy instincts. Some may lean toward deeper coordination with the United States. Some may inch closer to Israel in practical terms while avoiding public fanfare. Some may continue seeking mediation and ambiguity. Others may simply want the war to end at almost any price, even if that means preserving an unstable status quo. But one thing seems increasingly clear: the war is forcing choices. And that is particularly important for countries that have tried to maintain strategic flexibility between rival blocs or rival narratives. Once the pressure becomes direct enough, neutrality stops feeling safe. It starts feeling expensive. There is also the issue of future order. Gulf governments are not only asking how to survive the current war, they are also asking what the region will look like after it. If Iran emerges weakened but still capable of coercion, then the problem remains. If Iran emerges under a stronger containment architecture, that could reshape security calculations for years. If the war drives a deeper U.S. Gulf-Israel security understanding, that too could alter the map of alliances, even if much of it remains unofficial or indirect at first. This is why the reactions of the Gulf states matter so much. They are not merely spectators. They are barometers of regional confidence and potential pillars of whatever comes next. And while they may still move carefully, the direction of motion is becoming more important than the speed. Even small shifts in rhetoric, coordination, or maritime support could signal that the old pattern of quiet endurance is giving way to a new pattern of conditional alignment against Iranian pressure. If that happens, then one of Tehran's long-standing strategic assumptions may begin to break, the assumption that fear will always keep its neighbors fragmented, because fear can fragment. But if pushed too far, fear can also unite. The Northern Front, Lebanon, Hezbollah, and the war that refuses to stay contained. As the focus intensifies on Iran, the North remains a reminder that Israel is still fighting on more than one front. Southern Lebanon continues to produce danger, casualties, and uncertainty. There have been reports of Israeli soldiers killed and wounded in fighting there, underscoring the fact that while the world watches the larger strategic contest with Iran, the ground reality near the border remains lethal and unresolved. Hezbollah and aligned elements have not vanished from the battlefield. Their threat continues to shape Israeli military decisions, civilian life in the north, and the question of whether this front will stay limited or gradually expand. The fear is not theoretical. It is embedded in daily life for residents who have already lived through evacuation, return, renewed alerts, and the constant possibility that the next phase may bring even heavier fighting. The north carries a different emotional texture than the missile barrages in central Israel. There, the fear often comes from sudden incoming fire from afar. In the north, there is also the burden of proximity. The enemy is close. The terrain is familiar. The history is long. And every exchange carries the memory of what larger war on that border can look like. For communities there, this month has shattered any hope of a quick return to normal. People who had only recently begun rebuilding routines are again living with sirens, restrictions, school disruptions, and the sense that the question is not whether the threat remains, but how long the current tempo can continue before something bigger is required. That is the military dilemma. As long as hostile forces retain the ability to launch rockets, move weapons, and maintain infrastructure in southern Lebanon, pressure will remain for continued Israeli operations. But such operations are costly. They consume attention, readiness, and manpower. They create attrition. They complicate planning when other fronts are already active, and they never exist in isolation from the larger strategic contest involving Iran. There are also concerns about deception, intelligence, and the use of civilian or media cover for militant activity. Reports of operatives allegedly working under journalistic guise to assist Hezbollah intelligence reflect the blurred battle space that often defines this front. In such an environment, the war is fought not only through rockets and raids, but through surveillance, infiltration, and information exploitation. The deeper question, however, is whether Lebanon itself can or will change the equation. So far, there is little sign that the Lebanese state has both the will and the capacity to fully impose a new reality in the south. That leaves Israel confronting the same problem repeatedly. If the state next door cannot prevent attacks, then Israel believes it must continue acting to reduce the threat directly. This creates a grim logic of prolonged operations. No one presents that as ideal. It is expensive in lives, time, and political cost. But as long as Hezbollah and affiliated structures remain active, the pressure for continued military action remains. And that means Day 30 is not only about Iran and the possibility of a larger American move. It is also about the stubborn persistence of a northern front that refuses to disappear, no matter how much strategic attention shifts elsewhere. That is one of the cruelest truths of this war. Even as the center of gravity appears to move toward Iranian territory, missile diplomacy, and maritime escalation, the older fronts still bleed. Soldiers still fall. Border communities still live under stress. Families still ask whether the current fight will end with deterrence restored or merely pause until the next round. Until that question is answered, the North remains one of the war's most dangerous, unresolved spaces. How this war could end. Deal, escalation, or a forced reordering. After 30 days of war, the biggest question is no longer how serious this conflict is. The biggest question is how it ends. And at this moment, 3 broad paths appear to be emerging. The first path is a pressured diplomatic outcome. In this scenario, Iran agrees to terms significant enough to allow the United States and Israel to declare that major strategic goals have been achieved. That would likely require more than vague promises. It would require meaningful constraints, especially around maritime pressure, strategic weapons capability, and the systems that made this war possible in the first place. Such an outcome would be sold as peace through force, diplomacy made possible only because the battlefield changed Iran's calculations. The second path is a harsher military escalation if diplomacy fails. That escalation might still be limited in form, but it would be serious in effect. It could involve further destruction of infrastructure, maritime enforcement, direct action against remaining high-value strategic assets, or narrowly defined ground operations tied to specific objectives. In this path, the current deadline expires not into negotiation, but into implementation. The third path is the most unstable, a partial stop without resolution. In that scenario, some attacks slow, some diplomatic language emerges, but the underlying strategic problem remains untouched. Iran retains enough leverage to threaten shipping or rebuild pressure. Israel remains under intermittent threat. The Gulf remains uneasy. The proxies remain active. and the world pretends the crisis has passed while all the ingredients of the next round remain in place. That third path is precisely what many decision makers seem determined to avoid, because it would mean that after all this destruction, all this mobilization, all these casualties, and all this economic disruption, the region would still be one escalation away from another crisis. No side that believes it is paying a historic cost wants the final result to be a pause that solves nothing. That is why the next 10 days matter so much. This war is approaching the point where momentum itself becomes a strategic force. If Iran keeps absorbing losses without conceding the core issues, arguments for sharper action will grow. If the United States keeps moving forces while extending diplomacy, expectations will rise that the military posture is not theater, but preparation. If the Gulf states continue edging toward firmer cooperation on maritime security, the coalition logic hardens. If the proxies keep widening the conflict, the case for a broader response strengthens. In other words, the war is beginning to narrow the space for ambiguity. For Iran, the choice may be whether to cut a deal before the remaining leverage disappears. For Israel, the objective is to ensure that the war does not stop before the threat has been sufficiently degraded. For the United States, the challenge is to end the conflict in a way that preserves deterrence, secures critical waterways, and avoids an endless occupation while still proving that aggression has consequences. For the region, the stakes are enormous. Energy markets, shipping routes, political alignments, proxy networks, domestic pressures, strategic credibility. All of it is tied now to how the war concludes. So how does it end? Right now, the most honest answer is this. It ends when one side decides the price of continuing is finally higher than the price of compromise, or when the other side decides compromise is no longer enough. That is the razor's edge. And the world is now watching as all of those calculations race toward the same deadline.
Final monologue. The next 10 days. The next 10 days may define not only the future of this war, but the future shape of the Middle East. That is not exaggeration anymore. That is the direction of the evidence in front of us. Israel remains under fire, but it is also pressing its air campaign deep into Iran's strategic infrastructure. Iran remains defiant, but every passing day seems to narrow its room for maneuver. The United States is still allowing space for diplomacy, but the movement of forces suggests it is preparing for a scenario in which diplomacy fails. The Houthis have entered the fight. Lebanon remains unstable. The Gulf states are under pressure. The Strait of Hormuz remains the most dangerous choke point in the world. All of these threads are tightening at once. This is why Day 30 feels different. Not because the violence is new, but because the structure of the war is changing. We are moving from the first phase, where each side tested the other and established positions, into a second phase where deadlines, forced posture, and strategic consequences may force decisions that cannot easily be reversed. Maybe Iran chooses a deal. Maybe the pressure becomes too much to ignore, and the regime calculates that survival requires concession before the remaining strategic pillars are broken. Maybe the United States decides that enough progress has already been made and that additional escalation is unnecessary if key assurances are secured. Or maybe none of that happens. Maybe the deadline passes. Maybe another strike lands where it should not. Maybe another proxy front ignites. Maybe a maritime incident changes everything overnight. Maybe the deployment of Marines and naval power, which today still functions as a warning, becomes tomorrow's operational reality. That is the tension of this moment. The war is still moving, but the window for controlling where it goes next may be closing. And so the world watches the calendar, watches the shipping lanes, watches the skies over Israel, watches the strike reports inside Iran, watches the Gulf, watches Washington, watches Tehran. Because somewhere between now and April 6th, this conflict may reveal whether it is heading toward a forced deal or toward the kind of escalation that redraws the strategic map for years to come. For now, one thing is certain. The first month of the war has ended. The most dangerous decisions may still be ahead.